Hi everyone, welcome to our second webinar, How Clinicians Can Facilitate Positive Transformational Change and Growth Following a Psychosis. Today presents is Gerald Jordan, PhD, University of Yale, Program for Recovering Community Health, Fiona, University of Nottingham, Institute of Mental Health, and Robin Thomas, University of Edinburgh Global Mental Health. So next, please. I will do some housekeeping information. So participants' microphone will be muted. And please, if you have any question or difficulties with the Zoom, send to us text on the chat, and then we'll help you. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat. And also, please answer the post-event survey. The section is being recorded and it will be available by the next business day. Tomorrow, you can see, you can check in information and share with your colleagues. If you have any questions after this section, please contact us. Next, please. Here's our disclaimer and also your grant number. This will be available tomorrow if you have any questions or comment. Next, please. The MATCC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in our activities. Please check the language that we have been used on this slide. Next, please. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you my friend and my colleague, Gerald. Gerald, please, the floor is yours.
Hey, cool. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome everyone to this presentation. I'm happy to see that we're a smaller group this time, which means that we could have like more of a conversation. And we'll be able to answer questions easier than the last time. So yeah, looking forward to that. So yeah, I'm Gerald, and I'm a postdoc. I've been doing some research on post-traumatic growth. I did that during my PhD, and I continue to do some of that, similar types of work now during my postdoc. And I'm happy to be presenting and to be meeting with everyone. Fiona, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Fiona Ng. I'm also a postdoc, but at the University of Nottingham. I work in the recovery research team. I work on a trial called NEON, or Narrative Experiences Online. And yeah, one of the research areas that I work in is also in post-traumatic growth in psychosis. So really excited to be here and really excited to be answering questions and sharing some knowledge that I have. And Robin?
Hello, yes, my name's Robin. I'm originally from Canada and I worked in the mental health field there for various mental health charities. I see we have a few people from BC attending today in Kelowna and Victoria. So hello, I hope those of you in BC are managing the floods and whatnot all right. Yeah, and I'm living here now in Edinburgh, and I just completed my master's in global mental health and society at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm also looking at how meaning making can influence transformation and positive change after an episode of what we call psychosis.
Cool. So yeah, just a heads up. This is going to be kind of like a more of a conversation type of presentation. So it's not going to be like us presenting a bunch of slides. We've prepared some stuff to talk about beforehand, but yeah, this format is kind of just like supposed to be more like of an informal exchange between Fiona, Robin, and I, and then with everybody in attendance. So with that, I'll get started. We'll get started. And to start, we have the most important question up on as a slide over here. How should we not facilitate post-traumatic growth? So we're asking that before we're going to talk about how we should facilitate post-traumatic growth. So I mean, even before thinking about like how to facilitate it, I think clinicians, you know, and I'm not a clinician. I worked in clinical settings, and I work with a lot of you know, people with lived experience, that sort of thing. And so I'm coming at this from that kind of perspective of someone who's a researcher, and who's done a lot of work in this area. But you know, with that said, you know, based on the work that I've done, there are like, you know, I feel like a lot of, you know, ethical challenges with post-traumatic growth that haven't been really sorted through yet, and they're kind of important to think about in the context of, you know, providing services, and specifically thinking about how clinicians could foster post-traumatic growth or positive change. And like, that's not to say that I want to say that I don't think, or we don't think positive change or post-traumatic growth isn't something that's important. We just think that it's important to just, you know, highlight some of the things that we need to think about before, you know, jumping into this as clinicians or otherwise. So, and I guess the first thing that I would bring up would be like, you know, why should anybody facilitate, like, why should we facilitate post-traumatic growth? Why should anybody experience post-traumatic growth? You know, should we expect it? You know, I don't think anybody should be expected to grow following a psychosis, if you want to call it that, or any other type of trauma. You know, dealing with something like a psychosis and the aftermath of a psychosis could be challenging enough, and you know, to put the weight of having to grow on, you know, on somebody could be like a really daunting task, and can make you know, people feel you know, like it's a big significant thing. And I think, you know, that shouldn't be like the expectation coming into, like, you know, clinical care. I don't know if Robin or Fiona, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that, you know, if clinicians want, or if people would like to talk about or have conversations about post-traumatic growth, it should be done in collaboration with service users, or if there are any interventions that are developed that's targeted at fostering post-traumatic growth, they should be done in conjunction with or in tandem with other services. It doesn't mean that, you know, services should be cut or anything like that just because someone has grown. And that's definitely not my hope or vision for PTG in the future.
Yeah, and I think also someone brought up a great point in the last session, that just because someone might experience growth, post-traumatic growth and change, that there also might be a lot of other a sense of loss, for example, that people might experience after a psychosis as well. And certainly it can be really devastating for a lot of people. So it's an awareness that we're also acknowledging that. It's just that things like post-traumatic growth in relation to psychosis aren't often talked about. And again, we really don't want to put more onus or responsibility on individuals for achieving this perfect recovery and achieving growth and finding the silver lining in their suffering. It's more about, well, how do we support people to have this kind of experience if that's what they want, and how do we validate people who do feel that they've experienced growth after psychosis?
Yeah, that's really well put, Fiona and Robin. Yeah, I mean, I have here on the slide that one of the ways not to support post-traumatic growth is to think that everybody should be growing. Everybody should be like an enterprising, motivated, self-determined person who needs to like take everything and like build on it. Like that's not what, you know, the expectation should be in clinical settings. Like I think the expectation should be that, you know, services and like the economy, political system, society should just be like super supportive and help foster you know, good development and yeah, good outcomes among people who've suffered. Yeah, I also, yeah, we, you know, Robin, you mentioned you know, not ignoring suffering the stress, and that's you know, obviously a very important point. Like you know, just because, you know, like the idea of like helping someone or supporting growth doesn't imply that you should be ignoring like all the other, you know, things that might be going on in somebody's life. I think clinicians should be supporting people along the various aspects of their healing. Yeah, and I guess like one other thing that I would mention is like it might be like, I don't know, right after, maybe like the second week after COVID hit, I remember reading like a blog on Psychology Today, and you know, someone was writing about how we're gonna like how we could like facilitate post-traumatic growth after COVID. And I remember one of the ways that this person endorsed facilitating post-traumatic growth was by encouraging clients to make downward comparisons to people who've been less fortunate to them. And then from that, you could find ways to grow. And you know, on ethical grounds, I think that's just morally bankrupt. I don't think that's like a way to, you know, there's all these different ways to facilitate post-traumatic growth. And I would say that that's not one of them. I don't know. I don't know if anybody like Robin or Fiona, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, that's not something that we really prepared for in the presentation. So we could skip to the next part, but if you have anything to say on that, like feel free to mention something.
Yeah, I think also another point is that it's not to say when we're talking about post-traumatic growth, it doesn't mean that we glorify trauma, and it definitely doesn't mean that we imply that trauma is a thing to experience. They're kind of taking it back. We can't ignore suffering, we can't ignore distress. We know that trauma and psychosis can be quite negative experiences, but acknowledging that some people do grow from it and it's not talked about. So perhaps bringing this phenomenon to light is also important.
Mm-hmm. And also that it's not just the trauma of having a psychosis, but also how society responds to those states, which can often be quite negative and unhelpful.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, now that we've talked a little bit about that, I mean, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I would add. I guess I would add, like, you know, yeah, I think we need to also be cautious about talking about post-traumatic growth with people. Like, I think people could, like, just like some people could feel validated by hearing this kind of stuff, but then other people could feel like re-traumatized. They might feel like they're not doing enough, or you know, they could just feel a little hurt by it, or guilty, and like it's just I think like whenever, yeah, we just have to be like super careful and mindful about that. Yeah. Okay, so how do we support post-traumatic growth? That's why everyone's here during the presentation. So I mean, I think you know, based on what we just said, and based on what like the people who've written kind of like clinical manuals about post-traumatic growth would say, is that to support post-traumatic growth, you kind of, you know, you don't force it. You don't like say, okay, we're gonna grow today during this clinical encounter. Like, if people bring it up, that, you know, that's great. Don't expect it, and then you kind of just like, you know, hold people's hands along the way. So you might be like, oh, okay, so you know, you're appreciating your life more than you were before. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? You know, and you kind of go from there. You make these kind of small little take these small little steps with people. Yeah. And then another, I guess, important thing would be like, you know, based on my own research, is to foster environments, or to be a type of clinician that creates like a safe, warm environment for people. You know, it's important for people to feel like they're human beings, that they're, you know, that they're treated with dignity and respect. You know, a lot of work around recovery-oriented services has been done and written about. Like, I think those are the types of services that kind of embody what it means to like create a growth nurturing environment. So it's really about, you know, creating environments that are going to really support people along whatever journey they make. And these types of environments seem to be the conducive to supporting post-traumatic growth. I don't know if Fiona, Robin, you have anything that you would like to add about those points?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about fostering supportive and safe environments. So, for example, when it comes to co-creating interpretations of distress, am I getting ahead of myself, Gerald, or can I jump into that now?
I think we could do it. Yeah, we could jump into it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, being allowed to make sense of and find meaning in experiences of psychosis has been shown to be a really important factor in recovery. And oftentimes, people with psychosis are considered to lack insight into their condition, and their capacity to make decisions in their best interest is often called into question. And so people are often forced to adopt the medical framework, for example, for making sense of what they're going through, regardless kind of their cultural context, if it fits within their worldview and life experience, and whether or not they find it beneficial. And a lot of people dealing with coercive care feel like, well, they're being forced into this environment. It can be very frightening, and that can certainly be a barrier to experiencing growth and positive change. And I think it's important too to recognize that these experiences can be deeply personal and meaningful. And a lot of people that I spoke with in my research talked about their frustrations of not being allowed to speak about their experiences in psychosis at all, and even make sense of the content or what they were going through. They really were afraid of being misunderstood or treated coercively, or having their medication increased, and they felt that there was just only focus on symptom reduction and medication regimes, and they needed more than that. They needed someone to meet them where they were at, right? And to feel safe that they could actually express what was going on with them. And that can be a situation where people really feel disempowered and lose a sense of agency and trust in others, and trust in themselves, and their way of experiencing the world. And they can also start to feel like that when their condition is when they're told that psychosis is chronic and sort of debilitating and incurable, it really reduces the hope that people can feel for the recovery. And also understanding how different ways of maybe making sense of and understanding what has happened to them, and maybe some of the social and cultural and personal factors that are happening in their life that might be contributing to this state. Being allowed to explore those things in a way that perhaps, just allows more agency, and can. And is more empowering, I suppose.
That's a good point. Several very good points. Fiona, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, not really. I think Robin has covered it really well. I think it's really kind of coming from where the service user or the person with experience can come from and can understand. And I think that's the only way you can really develop a good working relationship with each other in order to help people. And
I guess I'll just highlight that I think it's just really important that clinicians, especially working in psychosis, understand that it's a possibility, that post-traumatic growth and positive change is a possibility, and that when it comes up in clinical settings or in a conversation, that it's not seen as a delusion. Because I mean, this isn't something that I found in my research, but during conversations with clinicians, like sometimes clinicians will be like, well, this must be some kind of symptom or something, or like it's impossible. Well, how is this even possible? Just recognizing that it is possible, like anybody else, like post-traumatic growth is something that could be experienced, regardless of a person's diagnosis or what have you. Okay, moving on. So I have here spiritual coping as a way to support post-traumatic growth. And this is something that's based on kind of like my own research that I did during my PhD. And I'll just be like upfront and say that I'm not a spiritual person. I'm not religious. I'm an atheist. So like, I don't really have a good handle on how to talk about spirituality and religion. But that said, I recognize that spirituality and religion is super important for a lot of people. And so in my research, what I found was that people who used spiritual coping, so like praying and like attending religious services, seem to be the people that grew the most. And that's what I found when I gave questionnaires, and from a quantitative perspective, and then from a qualitative perspective, like during interviews, people also really highlighted the importance of spirituality and helping them grow and stuff. Another study that I did kind of looked at, well, what I did was I asked clinicians to rate their service users' post-traumatic growth, and I compared those ratings to service users' own ratings of post-traumatic growth to see if there were differences. And so what I found was like clinicians rated spiritual growth of their service users the lowest out of all the other domains of growth. So it seems like clinicians might not, I mean, one reason could be that clinicians just don't really recognize post-traumatic spiritual growth as happening. And there's this whole literature showing that there's just like a stigma about talking about spirituality and spiritual stuff in general, and like early intervention for services for psychosis and psychosis settings in general. I've actually seen that mostly in Canada, where I'm from. Like people seem very hesitant to talk about that. I did notice while I was in the States, I was there for like 2 years, that people were a lot more comfortable with talking about spirituality in clinical settings, even with people with psychosis. But yeah, that said, you want to support post-traumatic growth, maybe be open to like, people's expressions or spiritual interests, or, what they're doing spiritually or religiously in their lives. Robin, Fiona, do you have anything that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I think,
go ahead.
Yeah, so I think in the literature, it does talk about, so caveat as well, not the most spiritual person in the world, or religious for that matter. But the literature does talk about, I think it's like the religiosity gap. So it's like the difference in value that is placed in on spirituality between service users and mental health workers. So one of my colleagues, Katia Milner at Nottingham, is looking at the role of spirituality in mental health recovery. So she looked at it from both a religious and non-religious point of view as well. And she's done a really great systematic review of, I think, about 38 papers, and found that there was about 6 themes surrounding spirituality and mental health recovery. And it included things like meaning making, identity, service provision, being able to talk about it, how it interacts with symptoms, and also just coping as well. So it gave rise to a really good framework called Mystic. So if you want more information about it, I'll link it into the chat, and so I'll link to the paper. And she's also created some really great resources that are based on the Mystic framework that can act as like conversation starters or self-reflection tools. So the link is in the chat if you'd like to have a look.
Cool. I think I read that paper, and it's a really interesting paper.
Yeah.
So thanks for bringing that one up. Robin, do you have anything that you would like to add, or would you want to move to the next point?
I mean, so quite a few people that I've spoken with and participants in my research did find that a spiritual kind of understanding of what they were going through was quite helpful and beneficial in moving forward and finding some meaning and insights into what they were going through. So and a lot of people don't even like the term psychosis. They might prefer the term altered state of consciousness or extreme state. Some people conceptualized what they were going through as a kind of shamanic initiation crisis or a spiritual emergency, and that this had more to do with what they were grappling with in terms of meaning making and life and issues of the spirit. And it wasn't just that they were dealing with this kind of illness, and people, it wasn't that they necessarily fully rejected the biomedical model, but they found that these other kind of more spiritual models allowed them to address different aspects of recovery that were lacking in other forms of more mainstream care that they received. And sometimes the psychotic content itself was perceived as very meaningful, and sometimes involved religious or spiritual imagery, and it wasn't all negative. Sometimes it was people feeling the sense of divine love and acceptance that they've never experienced before, finding a sort of self-acceptance or a different way of being in the world. Sometimes it was about being connected to nature and to other people in a deeper way, or feeling like there was some kind of purpose to what they were experiencing, which again kind of created this more hopeful framework and allowed them to come to terms what they had gone through. Also, Tanya Luhrmann is an interesting researcher who looked at different cultures and how they treated voice hearing. So she looked at people in Ghana and India and the States, and she found that in cultures that just pathologized anomalous experiences, so for example, hearing voices and whatnot, and feared voice hearing experiences, people had a lot more negative and fearful relationships with their voices. They were considered more cruel and distressing. And then in cultures where people kind of accepted having relationships with ancestors, or that, yeah, spirits exist, and kind of more of an acceptance of anomalous experience that was embedded in their spiritual upbringing and their culture, they had the capacity to sometimes have more positive relationships with voices. So that's kind of an interesting study in looking at how these things differ across various cultures, but how, again, spirituality can sometimes be a benefit to people.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds really similar to what I found in my research as well. And yeah, I actually attended a Tanya Luhrmann lecture, and I heard her speak about those themes, and yeah, super interesting. So the next point here is on alternative models that might be conducive to supporting positive change in post-traumatic growth. And Robin, this is something that you're really interested in. Do you have anything you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, sure. I'll try not to talk too much here, but one of the big ones that I think is open dialogue approach. I don't know if people have heard about that one. It was developed in Finland, and it's really designed to be very consensual and person-centered. And basically it involves working with the person in crisis, so usually with psychosis, and their social network and clinicians. And it's really an interesting model because it really does away with patient-clinician hierarchies. And it's really about trying to co-create meaning and make sense of what this person is going through, rather than immediately diagnosing them and offering this kind of one-size-fits-all solution. So, and the perspectives of everyone in the meeting, including the person who might be in florid psychosis, is considered valuable and is given, some value. And in this model, psychosis is seen as a response to difficult life events, and psychotic speech is often considered a form of communication that can provide meaningful insights into a person's distress and maybe ways out of that crisis. And short and long-term studies are quite promising in terms of how it has reduced hospitalization and dependency on neuroleptics, and improved rates of relapse. And it also is really, fits into a human rights framework in that it allows people to make their own treatment decisions. And then there's a few other models. For example, I certainly don't know them all, but Lauren Mosher developed the Soteria project, and the philosophy of that is really valuing being with clients in a really compassionate manner, and aiming to understand how they find meaning in their extreme states. and using minimal medication, minimal use of coercive and controlling interventions. And that also has follow-up studies with good recovery outcomes. And then there's the Hearing Voices movement. So that was really influenced by Marius Romm and Sandra Escher. And it views voice hearing and other anomalous experiences as meaningful and really existing within a spectrum of human experience. So not that they're just necessarily pathological, but they're states that people can cope with, they can learn from, and in certain circumstances, they can even have their quality of life enhanced by. Some people talk about, how their voices have helped them process trauma, and have helped give them a lot of self-insight. So it normalizes that experience, which a lot of people have found helpful. And there's hearing voices groups, for example, that people can attend. So yeah, those are some of the models that I've looked at. Fiona, did you want to talk about peer support?
Yeah, so I think peer support is increasingly quite common. So peer support by definition is when people with lived experience of mental health problems use their experiences to help other people. There are many different types, so from mutual self-help groups within the community, all the way to peer support worker roles within mental health services. And often in these roles, it's a job requirement that people who are employed as peer support workers use their lived experiences and all the learning that they've developed through life, I guess. We know that peer support work is really effective. So there was a really big Cochrane review that was done, I think, 2013, that synthesized findings from randomized control trials. So I think there was 11 RCTs that met their inclusion criteria, and it concluded that employing peer support workers achieves psychosocial mental health symptom and also service use outcomes that is no better or worse than what is achieved by mental health workers, which means that peer support workers are really cool because they're the only profession that actually has gold standard randomized control trial evidence for their effectiveness. So, we don't really see trials, for example, examining the effectiveness of psychiatrists or psychologists, so just saying. Yeah, there's a lot of benefits of peer support work. So, peer support allows people to give back, but it also reinforces that their lived experiences are valued, and it can help them to create meaning of their own experiences too. For mental health clinicians, it's also really valuable because working with peer support workers can help challenge some of the stigma that they may carry around. And for the service user, peer support workers can also act as roles for recovery, which can help to give hope for the future.
Cool. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen there's a research in Israel. I can't remember her name, but she's done some work looking at how doing peer support fosters post-traumatic growth. One person's name is Galia Moran, and then there's another researcher who she's worked with, who's done a lot of work in this area. And yeah, I guess I could put the person's name in the chat, but yeah. That sounds good. Yeah, and I guess the only thing that I would add would be earlier I talked about recovery-oriented services being conducive to supporting post-traumatic growth, and I think a good example of a recovery-oriented service is a specialized early intervention service for psychosis. I think in the States it's called coordinated specialty care. There are differences between the two. I'm not sure the extent of what those differences are. But they do embody a lot of the principles of recovery-oriented services. What I do find they're lacking, though, is, as Robin, what you were saying about the importance of meaning and meaning making in open dialogue and hearing voices groups and stuff. I don't think early intervention services are as good at dealing with that kind of stuff. They still operate within a psychological or a biological framework of understanding distress and distressing experiences or anomalous experiences. So they're a little limited in terms of that, and they have a little bit of a ways to go. So yeah. And then the next point that we have here is on narrative construction and the importance of narrative construction to supporting post-traumatic growth. Fiona, do you have anything that you'd want to add about that?
Yeah, so I think narrative construction is really important, and or narrative construction or storytelling is really important. So there's quite a bit of evidence now to suggest that self-disclosure or having the urge to talk and making meaning from one's experiences is associated with post-traumatic growth. And there are also some studies that have looked at, have done mediation analysis. And I think there was one that found that having meaning in life mediated the relationship between psychosis symptoms and PTG. So I think that the storytelling component and the self-narration component is really necessary in order to support post-traumatic growth and in order for it to occur. And I think it's also quite embedded within PTG theory too. So PTG theory indicates that there are two components. So assimilation of the new trauma information into the world, into a person's worldview, but also accommodation. So changing one's worldview to accommodate for the new trauma information too. So I've been doing a bit of work trying to develop a new intervention that integrates both narrative construction, but also the kind of more assimilation processes as well. So more CBT kind of approach. So at the moment, I've been trying to get funding to develop and test an online intervention called Positive Changes in Psychosis, or PosiChip. So feel free to suggest modifications and give feedback or anything like that. So I'm all ears. So I did work with a group of lived experience members. So it was a group of 5 people who had all had experience of PTG and psychosis. So Positive Changes in Psychosis, or PosiChip, is an online intervention. It will consist of 15 modules, including an online discussion forum that's moderated by a peer support worker. And so it's proposed that a lot of the modules, or each of the modules, will be presented weekly and separated into like 4 different sections. So orientation, getting everyone up to speed about what the intervention is about, what is post-traumatic growth, how does it work, and more cognitive behavioral components. So things like, we also know things like being able to cope, and cognitive restructuring and social support is also really important for post-traumatic growth. And then the narrative enhancement component, so being able to tell one story and also just engaging with narratives of others is also helpful. And then finally, a consolidation period where people kind of have the opportunity to go through all the modules that they hadn't done. So I guess that's the kind of intervention we're proposing. We're hoping that we get some funding to do this work. I'm not sure what else to say, but yeah, so if you guys have any questions about that, I'm all ears.
It sounds really innovative, and it's PosiChip. It sounds like something I want to eat.
Yeah,
like it's going to be something tasty.
It was very difficult coming up with the acronym, but so the tagline, as weird, and it's very weird, but so I'm actually Australian. So one of the taglines in Australia is like Aussie, 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 oi, oi, oi. So my partner and I decided to change it to Posi, 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 Chip, Chip, Chip. So that's how we ended up with PosiChip. But
I like it.
It's the fun things that we do as a researcher, I suppose.
Cool. Robin, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, I mean, psychosis is something that's so intertwined with a person's identity and personality. It's sort of like, which part is me and which part is, this experience. And so I think the narratives that people absorb about what they're going through, whether it's, an illness or whether it's considered something else, is inevitably just going to have a huge impact on identity and self-esteem and the person's life trajectory, in terms of if they feel like it's even possible to have hope, versus, having those limitations kind of magnified. There's also another sort of intervention that I've heard of being used called psychological formulation. I don't know if people have heard of that one. It's used by the British Psychological Society to restore the meaning in madness. And so it's really about working with a client and understanding their personal narrative of distress based on what has happened to them in their life and the wider, social context of that. And it's the philosophy is basically that however extreme or seemingly bizarre this person's experience is, on some level, it makes sense. And it's perhaps a normal response to an abnormal situation. And so I think definitely co-creating this narrative can be just really helpful and can really facilitate the experience of post-traumatic growth and positive change.
Cool. I don't think I have anything to add to this point. I think you both put everything very nicely. And I'm looking at the final point here about support social, political, and economic change, which sounds like a bit vague, but like yeah, I was mentioning this before we went live, but there's this a paper that is in press by someone in the UK where she describes how lived experience leaders become lived experience leaders, and how experiencing post-traumatic growth is like one of the steps to becoming a lived experience leader. And then today I was looking at this report released by a UK organization talking about lived experience leadership. And they were, in the report, they talk about how it's important to like make sure that the contexts where lived experience leaders are in are not stigmatizing, or supportive, or not harmful, and that kind of thing. So, this is like something to think about. If, we're going to help people facilitate post-traumatic, if we're going to support post-traumatic growth and expect people to like grow and that kind of thing, like we also have to make sure that, as a society, as people working in services or wherever we are, we have to make sure that the context that we're in are going to be supportive and not harmful to the people that are trying to grow into these positions, or, these relationships, or, whatever people are doing. That's the last thing I'll say about that. I'm not sure if if Fiona or Robin, if you have something to add. If not, we could just go to the questions and questions. Cool. Okay, so it's question time. So let's look at the questions, as if there are questions.
Thank you all. Thank you. That was very helpful. Please, if you have a question, just write in the chat, or if you want to ask, raise your hands and you can unmute your microphone and you can ask the question that you may have.
There's also a few questions from the last session that perhaps didn't get answered. So if there's anyone who was in last session and has an unanswered question from them, please feel free to bring that up now.
So we got one at the chart. Are there any specific adverse events you can think of that may be encountered in research, PTG, in individuals with experience of psychosis?
I could go first. So when I did my research, I didn't ask people if they wanted to participate in a study where I was exploring positive change or post-traumatic growth. I approached them and I said, look, I'm doing some interviews and I want to just ask you about how you feel you changed after your experiences. So I don't want to phrase it in terms of like positive or negative. I just wanted to hear about people's experiences. Because I was in part worried that if I was going to ask about ask people if they want to like participate in a study looking at positive change, that they might be like, well, I never, I don't have any positive changes that I could share with you, and I don't want anyone to feel bad about that. So you know that's one thing that I could think of, and that's one way that I kind of like handled that situation. I don't know if Robin or Fiona, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree, especially when you're interviewing and someone is having a really bad time and you're trying to kind of elicit information about growth. I think it's quite difficult, and it also puts the person in an awkward position. So I kind of often try and gauge where the person is at and whether or not and kind of approach the subject of, oh, would you like to talk about this, rather than just kind of ask the question.
Yeah, and all the interviews that I've done, I've never asked anybody directly about their post-traumatic growth or their their positive change or their transformations. Like I've just asked very broad questions, and then I've just people have talked about things, and I've just gone asked questions based on what they had just previously stated, and yeah, that way I'm not I'm trying not to make anyone feel bad or lead anybody in a direction.
Yeah, I guess in my research, I sort of did the opposite. So I specifically recruited people who, had experienced transformation and positive change after psychosis, because I was really interested in how people made sense of that experience, their life before psychosis, during psychosis, and after, and how they made sense of that, and to them, what kind of helped create that sense of change and growth, what was supportive help and what was harmful help. And yeah, I mean, people did feel quite happy to share those experiences, and some feedback was that it was kind of a experience that felt healing or validating, but of course there are obvious limitations to that kind of research, and that I wasn't interviewing people who felt that they had experienced negative change after psychosis, although people definitely did speak about both, that it wasn't just the positive change, it was also there were negative challenges and change that they experienced as well, and that changed over time.
I think that like people have so few opportunities to tell their story that they just appreciate it. I've been interviewed for stuff. I love that. Yeah.
Claire Bien has a question. Claire, please.
Thank you, Graziella. Let me lower my hand. I wanted to, it's not so much a question as opposed to a perspective, and also thank you, gratitude for your presenting such a wide array of approaches and ways of understanding and working with people who experience psychosis in making meaning and discovering what it is about their lives, their histories that has brought them to experience psychosis, and also when there is recurrence or a continuing challenge, how they can begin to look at the ways in which they're living their lives. I am a voice here, and I'm a member of the Hearing Voices Network and also ISPS. And in terms of spirituality, before I had my first episode of psychosis, I was agnostic, bordering on atheist, but my kind and helpful voices were so instrumental in helping me mostly lead myself out of psychosis, with some psychiatric support and of course family and friends who didn't mind that I'd been in the hospital. I came to believe in a higher power, that which we know or believe to be God. And as you all were speaking earlier about sort of the various spiritual perspectives and traditions, shamanism, and you didn't mention the psychic community, and also more traditional faith religions. I was thinking in terms of the sense of personal agency and the degree to which we have choice. And if one considers biology only and think, there is no hope. I have this intractable, incurable disease of the brain, and I will never be able to achieve anything close to what I could have before my life was so disrupted. But if there's meaning making and embracing the possibility of ancestors, and one of my voices was that of my father, who was wonderful, then there is opportunity to make sense of one's life in context with the way in which one lives one's life, and also what's going on in one's world, and removing oneself from toxic situations and toxic people, and choosing. And it is that sense of personal agency and which is all the things you said, altruism. And Gerald, I need to get in touch with you because I have been asked to provide some good references on altruism and civic engagement and recovery.
Okay.
But anyway, so all of that, it's all part of a piece, and having such an array of options gives people hope, and the process of exploration fosters growth, and it's just all wonderful. And thank you.
Well, thanks for that feedback. And yeah, I actually, when you mentioned the agency, like the agency piece is something that came up in my research as well. I didn't talk about it here, but a lot of people that I spoke to talked about agency in much the same way that you described.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that experience.
Thank you. And I just wanted to respond to Gerald. We're all very much alike, and our perspectives, once we really delve into what's going on within us, can resonate. I'll stop.
Thank you, Claire. We have one more question. For post-traumatic growth, are there certain factors about the individual circumstances that make post-traumatic growth more likely, more financial security or privilege intersectionalities? Do you see post-traumatic growth more like with YAVIS clients versus, just a second. But I lost the question.
Versus chronic and
sorry. Yeah, versus chronic and enriched population where the stress index is substantially high. Which population do post-traumatic growth methods work best with so far in terms of the literature?
There are, certain factors about people that, okay, computer restored. Yeah, I guess there are factors about individuals that make post-traumatic growth more likely. So, I didn't look at that much in my own research. So what I did find was using spiritual coping, having resources in your environment to help you deal with stress is important. Finding ways to positively reframe the psychosis as something meaningful was important. And I did look at things like finances and socioeconomic status and class, and those didn't have anything to do with post-traumatic growth. So it seems to suggest that regardless of financial standing, people subjectively feel like they've that they could grow following a psychosis. I'm not sure what YAVIS stands for.
Is that young, attractive, verbal, intelligent, and successful, based on Google.
Wow.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great point about privilege and how all of these different factors intersect, you know, gender, race, whatnot, because we know all of these things impact mental health. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, the research I did was with people in 5 different countries, but it was also still, you know, it was very limited. There weren't enough people in the study to make these kinds of assertions. But I mean, one person, for example, did talk about how the austerity measures in the UK and sort of the reductions to his benefits did cause considerable challenges and kind of set him back in his PTG and recovery. And one of the things that he talked about that he said he had grown in many ways was feeling more authentic and connected to a sense of purpose, but he wasn't always able to even make use of that because, you know, he was so financially restricted, and that had to do with, again, how benefits were constantly decreasing. So I mean, I would love to do more research about how all of these things intersect and how privilege impacts growth as well. So I just think that's a great point.
Yeah, it's not something that's been looked at in the literature. Sorry, Fiona.
I agree. I think it's also a great point, and I think, you know, more needs to be done looking at it. In terms of populations, which populations do PTG methods work best with so far in terms of the literature? I mean, from an academic psychology point of view, it's been looked at in quite varying populations. So it's been looked in like health psychology, like in terms of cancer, and I think cardiovascular, like myoinfarctions, I think it's called, or something like that. Like it's been looked in refugees, in war veterans, and many different other populations. And I think in general, PTG does occur, but I think that says something about the scales that we have to measure PTG. So the most common one is called the PTGI, or the Posttraumatic Growth Inventory. However, that inventory is a retrospective measure. So they ask you to think back rather than a current standing one. So right now, how would you rate X? So I think perhaps it's also to do with methods, not just the population that we're looking at.
And I would add that there's been PTG studies looking at people who've experienced the first episode of psychosis, but then also among people who've experienced more than one. Yeah, my research has been only looking at people who've experienced one. Yeah.
There is also some literature, and there was a pilot study done that found that recovery outcomes for psychosis were actually often better in developing countries where there was less sort of mainstream treatment available. So that sort of adds another interesting factor into the mix as well, in terms of why that might be.
My old supervisor has done some research looking at the recovery between Canada and India, and one of the main factors explaining that is the role of family.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe having family support, as long as it's nice, could be important.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would like to thank you all again for this wonderful, rich, and thoughtful presentation. I'm pretty sure that the participants like a lot, and this presentation will be posted tomorrow. So please visit your page, tell to your friends, invite people to come to our MHCC and our webinars. I also want to thank you, Gerald, in special, to help me to put this webinar together. And I would like to ask you if you have any final thoughts. And I would like to ask the participants to please answer the post-event survey. Thank you, Gerald, Robin, and Fiona. Any final thoughts?
Final thought. thoughts. Yeah, I just in general, I think we need to we don't really have a good understanding about the influence of context and intersecting forms of oppression and marginalization on PTG, and that's like really important. And I hope someone does some research on it one day.
Yeah, thank you so much for the engaging questions.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, thank you all. If I not see you, have Thanksgiving. See you there. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.